So the first question I wanted to ask is, why did you decide to start the Videogame Heritage Society?
Yeah, sure. So Videogame Heritage, the Videogame Heritage Society is an initiative that came out of a research project that we set up at the University of Bath. So the ESRC funded a project. At the beginning, that was to look at the relationship between video games culture in Japan and in the UK. And so we did a series of projects thinking about how video games were exhibited. One of the initiatives that came out of that is an exhibit which you can see in the museum, which is called Platform X, where we've got a series of 14 different versions of the video game Space Invaders shown next to each other. What that exhibit does is it shows how video games sometimes are presented on different platforms, but the design can change over several iterations. So in the development of that project, our collaborators at the University of Bath, Professor James Newman, along with other collaborators in organisations like the BFI, Science Museum Group, began a conversation about how video games are cared for. And so out of that conversation was a decision to set up a group to formalise that discussion. That group became known as the Videogame Heritage Society. So out of that, we set up a website and we set up something called the Subject Specialist Network, which is a kind of academic grouping for these conversations. And that's where it's arrived at the moment. But over the next few years, what we'd like to do is really use that network, because within that network, there's about 150 individuals and organisations who are part of that network, and they can range from anything from really established museums, as I mentioned, like the Science Museum, really established archives like the British Film Institute, through to smaller museums like our museum, through to private collectors, people who are interested in maintenance of hardware, people who are interested in video game studies, so a whole range of people involved in that conversation. And what we'd like to do is really use that network to look at the questions that are starting to emerge within video games preservation. So for instance, we're very fortunate with video games where really video games as a cultural phenomenon, it's only been going for 50 years. So most of the important moments that happen within the development of video games, there's still probably somebody who's alive who you can speak to who will have either been directly involved in that innovation or will have been around as things were being developed. So one of the things that's on my mind is we need to capture stories of how those games were made. But another part of preservation which doesn't get thought about a lot, and which is really important for our museum, we often think about hardware, and I've got other examples in this cabinet here, but fundamentally video games only really make sense through the playing of the games. And so for our museum, over the next period, I'd really like us to focus on capturing stories and evidence of what it meant and what it was like to play the games at the time. Because sometimes we can look at a historic game, say like Pong, or Space Invaders, let's say. Space Invaders now, it's still nice, it's fun to play, but playing Space Invaders now doesn't give anywhere near the sense of what it would have been like in the 1970s when these unusual kind of cabinets were being installed in cafes. And Space Invaders was almost like the game was called Space Invaders, but also the kind of sense of these computerized entertainment systems moving into social spaces. That was a form of Space Invaders. So capturing those stories, I think, is going to be really important for us. But yeah, that's all to be we've only just started the Videogame Heritage Society.
Yeah, one of the things I was going to mention was that there's a very big current trend in the game industry of remaking older games. There's Final Fantasy VII has had that remake, and the Resident Evil 4 remake is coming out very soon. Do you think that remaking these games for console or audience, the sort of cultural context is lost? Like you mentioned, the experience of playing space invaders for the first time. Do you think by remaking a game, but you can't really remake the experience?
I think that question relates across all art forms. So if we think about cinema, the remakes of films, there are stories that are retold. A brilliant example is the Guillermo del Toro Pinocchio that's just been brought out of the cinema, where Pinocchio is a story going back decades and centuries, over a century, I think. And yet it's reimagined for an audience now. Similarly with video games, I think there are some instances where something is just kind of reissued on a more up-to-date platform, but there are some instances where a game is reimagined for a new platform and it creates an experience that has a continuity of meaning across a generation. So an example of that I can think of right now that seems relevant would be Mario Kart. So the new iteration of Mario Kart on the Nintendo Switch is as enjoyable and relates to the experience that I remember from Mario Kart when it first came out on Super Nintendo. Mario Kart on Super Nintendo was such a communal gaming experience. It was fun. It was a real kind of it was a new thing to see all of these characters from the sort of Nintendo universe brought into one place. And I can see with that now on the Switch, for me it's exactly the same experience. It's as enjoyable, it's as collective, and it's so good that even you'll see in our museum, Sega even tried to get in the act with their Sonic Racing, which is a similar sort of game that uses the sort of Sega universe. So I think there is a place for remakes, but I do also I would say the same criticism of remakes that you see in other art forms, where the reason companies will go for remakes is because the brand is already known, and so somebody might be more likely to buy something with a name they know rather than something new. And the risk there is that you don't get innovation or the pioneering games coming through. So I think there is a fair criticism, but I do think there is a place for remakes.
Do you think that there is obviously merit in playing older games and when they be considered dated or almost obsolete by the standards?
So in our museum, we try to be quite I wouldn't say agnostic of the age of the games. What we try to do is we try to bring together games that might be from the 1980s, the 1990s, up to 2000s, 2010s, and the present day. We try to show the games, in relation to one another. I will say that playing older games, they do need a level of kind of contextualization. So if you are playing a game like Donkey Kong is a really good example. Donkey Kong is a really playable, really engaging game. But if you were to compare it, graphically to something that's been out now on PlayStation 5, you would say, well, this can't compete on a graphical or technical level. But actually, this is where, for me, video games have a lot of artistically, it's almost like theatre. If what you see in front of you on the stage, you can have the most elaborate set, or you can have a very sparse set. What matters is your engagement with the ideas and your engagement with the experience. And so once you acknowledge, all right, the graphics of this are not necessarily going to be that sophisticated, challenge of, getting Mario before he was known as Mario, he was called Jumpman, to get to the top of this scaffold, that remains a challenge and that remains compelling. And the physical experience of using, authentic joysticks and things like that, and some buttons, that is a rich experience, culturally.
I like the comparison you made between video games and theatre, because I'm very interested in theatre myself. I'm directing a musical at the moment at my university.
Oh, wow.
So I think there's a very interesting comparison to be made in terms of there is a suspension of disbelief when you're watching a stage performance. The audience can understand that you have to fill in the gap here or imagine this here. And I think it comes down to how well the performance is for both. Because I think it doesn't matter if a costume is shabby or a video game sort of doesn't have very modern day graphics. It's down to how engaging the story is, how believable the characters are. And I think it's another way of looking at video games as an art form, because that's still a debate that's going on even now.
It really is a debate, and that's where my background is from. Artistic practice. I was a practicing artist for over a decade, and worked in performance art, and have exhibited internationally. Where I see video games, there's probably a bold statement, I need to back this up, but we'll back it up through practice over the next period. But I think video games are the most important technology of our time. And I think that because, as you say, you have this level of engagement and this unusual attribute of agency when you're experiencing a video game, where you're taking decisions, and these decisions can influence you emotionally. This can kind of have a feedback loop to your actual behaviour, things that you think about in your life more broadly. And that's different to cinema or most forms of theatre. There are forms of theatre that involve interactivity and things like that, but where I draw the relationship with theatre is a good example would be text-based games. And there are really good platforms like Twine where people can make their own text-based game, and it may say, do you want to open this door or that door? Do you want to go, speak to this person or this person? And it's purely text on the screen, but in the mind of the individual playing the game, really it's down to their imagination how rich this experience is, and that's a really powerful thing. And so I think we can all get kind of carried away with the graphics and the processing power and the speed and the realism of character representation, things like that. But we all know, and it's the same with cinema, it's the same with most art forms. It's not about how much money we're spending on this, it's actually the artistic vision and the richness of the experience. And that can actually be sometimes the result of the community involved as well. A game like Minecraft is really about the community's investment in that environment, rather than a kind of top-down vision of one visionary author or designer. So I really think that we're only beginning to scratch the surface of how important gaming, video games culture, and kind of wider game-like experiences are and will be over the 21st century.
I think it's a very interesting point to make about how you're not only preserving the actual consoles, the hardware, but how you're sort of preserving an experience. The exhibits out there, such as the PlayStation with the blue tack in it, showing sort of lived experience of how people would sort of pirate their own games or mod their own consoles. I think it's really interesting to show not just what these objects are, but how people interacted with them and how it affected their lives.
Yeah, I mean, the sort of social context in which video games exist, I think is something that most museums and cultural organisations tend not to reflect on so much. We did a project that we're very, very proud of during the pandemic, which was called Animal Crossing Diaries. And so you should have a look at this online, it's all archived online, and it's actually being archived But for Animal Crossing Diaries, we essentially created a website where individuals who were playing the video game Animal Crossing New Horizons could log on and they could basically write their own account of how they played, what they were doing within the video game Animal Crossing. What we were interested in when we set the project up, we set it up before the pandemic, so we didn't know this was going to happen. But we were interested in thinking about the video game Animal Crossing New Horizons as essentially video games as new kinds of social spaces where people are spending a lot of time, they're interacting with friends, they're perhaps creating their own social events or whatever. But what we didn't anticipate, nobody could anticipate, was that the COVID-19 pandemic would happen, kind of March, April 2020, we entered into lockdowns. So what we have with that project is almost like a time capsule of what it was like to be playing the game Animal Crossing, but actually to be living within the COVID-19 pandemic and in the early days of it. So if you have a look at that website, what you'll see are people who maybe didn't think of themselves as gamers, but they suddenly had time and they thought, oh, I'm going to get into this game. But you also had people who, maybe they had important life moments. They might have had a birthday, or they might have had something they wanted to celebrate. They couldn't be in person, so they met in a video game. We even had some really quite sad things, because some of these are accounts of children as well. We had a child whose pet had died, and they decided to do a kind of memorial event within the video game. And so I think what we've ended up with there is both an interesting account of how people were choosing to play this game, but also, I think, a really valuable insight into what it was like sociologically, psychologically, in that early period of the pandemic. And I think there are very few other sort of forums where you get that insight in the same way. So yeah, I think that the social context within which the games are being played and what the games mean to people, for me anyway, as creative director of this museum, that for me is as important, if not more important, than the hardware. And that's where we want to focus really for the next, hopefully the next couple of decades.
Yeah, are there any plans for the museum going forward that people can look forward to?
Yeah, so we've got a project which we've been doing with, one of the things about the museum is, in its earlier iterations, the original museum is in Nottingham, a lot of what the museum has in its collection are items that have been brought to us or gathered by video game enthusiasts, people who are really passionate about collecting the objects, about preserving the history. And so the collection that we have, in some ways the way we present it at the moment, is quite, I think, technologically focused, it's quite chronologically presented, and it's focused on probably stories about the development of video games that a particular audience who are already excited about video games can relate to. But what we've been doing over the last 6 months is we've been working with our wider community. So we're in Sheffield, but actually Sheffield's part of a wider city region that includes Barnsley, that includes Rotherham, Chesterfield. And we get a lot of visitors from these wider areas. So what we've been doing is bringing these visitors into our curatorial process and asking them, what are they excited about that is in our collection, what stories are meaningful to them, but also what is missing from our collection, what would they like to see, what kind of stories would they expect to see in the museum in the future. So we're going to be doing some, there'll always be like sketches to begin with, some small pop-up exhibitions that will showcase kind of new ideas, quite rough thinking about what the museum of the future could be. And then, fingers crossed, that will inform a new design process for a complete reimagining of how the museum presents its exhibits. So almost to turn the museum inside out. So rather than the museum presenting what curators, subject experts, all really important, what they think the museum should have, the museum will reflect much more what our audiences here in South Yorkshire and in the north of England think is important. So yeah, that's part of where we're headed.